Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. And instead of me just ranting at people and doing my critiques, I wanted to talk a little bit about organizing in quotation marks. And I always put organizing in quotation marks because it's a word that's used so much that it almost has no meaning for a lot of people who even do it. I was a union rep for 4 years. I was a fairly successful one within the context of getting people in my uh, area to join a union. I was not so successful in implementing change within the union itself. I also am notoriously uh, skeptical about holding myself to group discipline lines that I don't agree with. And I do think you need to have a strong sense of self to do that, to know which groups you would be willing to discipline by. If you cannot accept a group's discipline, you shouldn't be in that group. But those are basic things. Let's get into some more positive and negative elements of organizing, habits that the left have that they've gotten through years of habitus, things that they've done on campuses, things that they've done in rallies, and things that developed under different material conditions, and talk about how to pivot them into things that are more positive. A lot of mutual aid developed during the COVID situation, and it was based on a lot of labor and a lot of extra money lying around, and it burnt out within 2 years. I watched mutual aid orgs develop quickly after the BLM things during COVID, and I say things because I don't even know what to call them anymore. Recuperated insurrections, is that what we call them now? Liberalized real grievance, is that what we call them now? Anyway, they burnt out a lot of people because they became basically charity. But the response to that, even in some of the elements of the Democratic Socialists of America, was to say that we need to go immediately for national level structural change without realizing the scale difference between the two. So let's break this down a bit. Mutual aid that is not mutually beneficial is charity. End stop. Mutual aid that is mutually beneficial is a way to reinforce social bonds and material interest. A strike fund is mutual aid for everyone participating in the strike. A common food kitchen is mutual aid if it's not solely dependent on one group of people giving charity or donations to another. I've seen mutual aid orgs. In fact, I was participating in one here in Utah that basically became inefficient NGOs without a legal board because all they did was allocate funds and call for basically GoFundMe's for various people who needed immigration lawyers. They couldn't ask anything because they were not actually in the same game as the people they were helping. So it wasn't actually mutual. It was a misrecognition of what the concept is. But just turning to canvassing and pivoting politically, when you were a group, even at the height of the DSA of 100,000, in a country of, let's say, 170 million voters and 340 million people, canvassing without large amounts of resources and money isn't going to work at the national level. And it probably isn't even going to work at the local ones because some other donor can come out and obscure you. And there are people who say, oh, we need to hold our electeds accountable. The problem with that, though, is to hold them accountable, you also have to protect them. If you hold them accountable before you can protect them, all you are is a godfly because they're going to get money, our resources, our names, or something from someone else. So the entire framing of this debate, which I saw on Twitter for 2 years during the Biden administration about mutual aid versus canvassing and changing laws, fundamentally misrecognizes what both things are for and the power of the people trying to pull both things. When you are a minority position holder and you're trying to win, it is actually easier to be obstructionist. Ask the Tea Party, ask socialists before 1914. Um, and if you align with anyone, you often don't even endorse them. You just don't oppose them. You allow something to go through without your comment. All right. That is strategic. The right uses it all the time, and they understand that. When you are asking people to give you volunteer work, as times get tougher, you're going to have less volunteers, particularly if times are tougher in an economic way, not just in a social crisis way. So you have a lot of people who couldn't work during COVID, or were working from home, or whatever. That's a different scenario than in an economic downturn. Even Occupy Wall Street's relationship to the economic downturn is about 3 years later. One, because it emerged because people being frustrated with promises made by the Democrats not happening, although we forget that. Two, because people had to have relative resources to do it again. Okay. So first principle we deal with here, if we're organizing, we must design things to be mutually beneficial with a clear goal, a limited strategy to win a specific thing. Now, I'm a believer in like radicalism. I would like to change the entire world, but you don't do that all at once. Even Marxists know this, right? Um, that's why you talk about transitional forms and all this other stuff. And we can get lost in the abstract debate around that. And I think a lot of us have. So mutual aid must be mutually beneficial. You can only be mutually beneficial when you have skin in the same game. And that's going to be a protection from burning out. Two, routinize and systemize is actually super important for organization. Just like if you add passive exercise to your life as opposed to exercising principles, which are good but require more discipline. And if anything comes up in your life, like I had a medical scare and my job increased my workload dramatically in the last year, what's the first thing to fall out? The gym. You might even see it in my face, right? So what do I do to compensate for that? Well, I try to incentivize structures where I can walk, or where I do lifts as part of work. So I'm constantly moving my books around and stuff because it's exercise. It's exercise I might do. When you can make a choice to routinize something, it's going to make it easier to do. You should encourage your members who are organizing with you to do things that are routine and easy. If you need to collect signatures, have them collect signatures in places where they already have social relationships. If you need them to go to a rally, don't ask them to rally constantly. I'll get to rallies and protests in a second because I'm super critical of them, but I do think they have one or two functions, and most people underutilize the one or two things they're actually good at. So if you routinize things and they become part of your normal life, they're easier to maintain. That's true in exercise, that's true in eating habits, that's true in organizing politically. There is only so much cognitive load that a person can put into organizing all the time when they're already burnt out. You have to make it easy for families to participate, and you have to make it easy as something you can do both actively and passively. You need both. Systematize as opposed to bureaucratize. Bureaucracy is necessary, but bureaucracy is costly. And it has its own natural drift. Conservatives aren't wrong about that. All right. Now, one thing that ironically modern capitalism has been great at is the need for constant monitoring and development, which has its own cost. And often it's cost in terms of bureaucracy. So when you can systematize as opposed to bureaucratize, it's better. Don't appoint a person to do what a simple guideline and checklist can do. Save the appointment of people, which are choke points where people can quit. I'm not even saying that people are going to sabotage you. It's just you burn people out. You over rely on central committees, you over rely on volunteers, and you burn them out. So when you can systematize, like, here's what you need to do, this step, this step, this step, this step, you do that. Now, to systematize, I actually go back to virtues. And believe it or not, my virtue theory is rooted in systems theory as well. What are you trying to cultivate? What principle are you trying to cultivate that is going to orientate your action that you can systematize to do this with minimal oversight and leadership? You need oversight, you need leadership, you need accountability, but the less distance there is between the leader and the people they are responsive to, the more responsive the leader has to be. And all leaders, I think, have a tendency, because we all have a tendency to do this, to want to reduce work and accountability. So they're going to try to increase that distance. And as an organization, your job is to try to decrease that distance. I'm not saying that some level of temporary hierarchy will not be there. Even very egalitarian societies have leaders in particular situations. You need good leadership. It's not going to, but good leadership is accountable leadership, and accountable leadership is not structurally and systemically removed from society and from the people they are serving. I hate to say it, but academia is very good at being very removed from the people they're talking about all the time, the oppressed and marginalized, in quotations, in binary ways, like you either are or you aren't, which of course everyone who really thinks about it for 5 minutes knows that that's not true. That nothing is that simple of a binary relationship. And that somehow academics are in this crucial nexus to deal with the people who are oppressed, even though they're also working in an institution that is a major driver of inequity, not just in terms of their education practices, which sort people for work, but also in terms of their endowments, which are basically hedge funds, which invest a lot in raising rents, and their medical practices, because a lot of these universities have major income from hospitals. This leads to a kind of activism that is very abstract and very much about policing individual choices, the way we speak, and codes of conduct within them to show belonging. It's a form of costly signaling, and I'll come to costly signaling in a second. Some of which are common courtesies, some of which really are about you proving that you belong to the group and are kinds of internal in-group social capital. You need to minimize that. I'm not saying you're not going to have it. There are always people who are going to establish in-groups and out-groups and moral factions. And again, this happens even in relatively egalitarian societies. But you want to minimize it. Factions, I'm not a supporter of faction bans, but factions should be functional, right? They should deal with ideological differences that are still within the parameter of the organization and its mission and of the social vision and virtues of which you want to do. And if you think about it this way, if you think about your orientation, then your program, then your orientation again. So what are you trying to do immediately? What's your long-term goal? And how do you orientate to get there? Your long-term goal often is going to be a negative goal. You want to undo X. Your vision of society might come from what you think would be a good society once you undo X. But you got to have tons of action steps, and there's got to be all kinds of things that are also changing to conditions and are occurring from groups that have strong social bonds to each other. We live in a very diffuse society where most things that people do to socially bond have become expensive. And even living near them is a cost. Like, it, you might be poor in New York City, but it's different than being poor in Alabama, right? And getting closer to New York is going to cost you in and of itself, because there's social resources for being there. You have to think about this when you're designing this stuff, and you need to take that map, not just of like the power of players in an area. What are the resources and needs of an area? This is why progressives and leftists have a hard time dealing with rural people. But the only time progressives and leftists have been successful historically is when they have at least a strong contingent of rural people on board. Now we could talk about, the peasants versus the working class. Well, farmers aren't necessarily peasants, and most of them don't even own their own lands and crops now anyway. So not that we're in a sharecropping situation, but you need to understand the rural, exurban, and suburban economies as well as the urban ones, and many people don't, even when we're doing worker organizing. Another principle you need to have is, in addition to mutual aid being beneficial, in addition to routinize and systemize as opposed to just bureaucratize, is you need to reduce costly signaling to when you need more core people. So yes, you might need people to be able to costly signal in a core of something, but that should not be how you define who's in the inner or outer limits of a social movement. And there's been a lot of confusion about this, where like you want to apply the most strenuous standards all the way across the board. That's a recipe for disaster, because you can't discipline those people. You're going to turn them off, and you can't help them. And it just seems like you're some nanny. Costly signaling does make some sense. We do it as a human species for a reason. And what I mean by costly signaling is when you have to do something, whether it's say something that's hold two completely incompatible ideas in your head, the guru principle, like you have to do that, or double thinks, what Orwell calls it. Or costly signaling is like cutting off enough people that you don't really have external checks on your in group. So there's no out group check on what you're doing. And whenever we talk about class solidarity or coalitional thinking, because you need to be both solidaristic, particularly in terms of class, but also coalitional, you have to quit pretending that there's any one person that speaks for the entire class, or any one idea that speaks for the entire class, or any one ideology that speaks for the entire class. Like, until you have a class organized for itself, and I don't even think the capitalists organize for themselves right now, to be completely honest. But that's why I talk about the degraded social subject so much. You can't really do that. So costly signaling makes sense in a time where you either the stakes are high enough that you need costly signaling, or the stakes are low enough that you can demand it. But otherwise, it actually trains people to let other people exploit them, because costly signaling usually means giving up your labor. It's something that, frankly, high intent demand religious groups, aka cults, will do to people to socially isolate them and limit them, and to artificially create a skin in the game scenario. Leftist groups do it. We have a lot of signaling words. We have a lot of jargon that we require people to learn. We have a lot of things that are required of them. It's bad to do. There's a reason why successful organizations might only do that to the inner cadre of the people you might call on, not even for the most power in an organization, but the people you might call on where you need the most discipline. You might need them to costly signal, but you shouldn't demand that of everybody. All right. Some other things as you're dealing with burnout. One, you need to be as efficient as possible with some redundancy. If you're too efficient, you rely on too few people, and when they burn out, you're not efficient anymore. You have cascade failure. I used to talk about this a lot in the early periods of the show, but this is why. You see organizations, particularly guru organizations, but all kinds of organizations, that die the moment one or two key figures are gone, because they've over relied on them and burnt them out. But that was a choke point. You had people putting in more than they were getting out. I am not saying self-sacrifice is not important. I am not saying discipline is not important, but you should not demand self-sacrifice or discipline without people getting something back. And I hate to tell you, but religions actually do know this. Religious organizations tend to actually understand that people have to get stuff back. So redundancy, too much is bad because it's too much overhead. But like when you're relying on volunteer labor and that kind of thing, redundancy is good. You can delegate and spread things around, and those people can give you more input for how to do things better. So you can systematize more easily. The more input you have, the more you can do. And more work up front usually does equal less work later. If you put in the work to systematize reporting and doing, say, worker inquiry in an easy way, you'll be able to be more responsive to the workers in which you're helping. Same thing with activists, same thing with their concerns. When you get material wins at a local level, you can build that up through coordination. This whole another false binary we've been dealing with on the left for 20 years is local versus national. And frankly, I've started thinking, no, you have to think larger than national and smaller than national at the same time. There's been a whole lot of let's go do one violent push into voting someone into executive office without even trying to change their party or the union organizations, etc. That's always premature. You will fail even if you get the person in there because there's donors and other established systems of power that you haven't even touched that will be able to limit them or corrupt them. That's just a fact. You have to deal with that. And yes, some of that is calling people out, but that's not enough. If all you can do is call people out and you never have a reward, people are just not going to fucking deal with you. And I think we can learn that from the failure of progressive activism for the past 20 years. I hope this helps you start to think about how you would organize. And I want to make a last point here about rallies. If you think rallies are about speaking truth to power, the changes in military technology after the 1940s really make that a little different. One, they know the truth, they don't care. Which is not to say they understand the truth or believe in the truth, but they do. Someone's told it to them. They're aware of what these truths are. They might have 1,000 biases and political protections against them, but they know they exist. You're not telling them anything new. Two, massive protests are not proof of a voting block because even 10,000 people going out in multiple areas still not, even often a third of the population. It does show massive support and people want to put skin in the game, and that's good, but it's not necessarily going to equal people coming out to vote or anything like that. And even if they do come out to vote, what are they voting for? Are they just voting for an empty suit that's against the current suit that you hate? Well, that got us here in the first place, my friends. So what are you going to use the rallies for? Rallies give people a sense that they are seeing people like them. Use it for that. But no, there's bunches of groups competing for you for that, and you have to be coalitional and limited when you do that. That's the only purpose I really see that rallies serve is kind of a morale boost for people operating together and learning that they can operate together, but they're not speaking truth to power anymore. And the historical reason for petitioning for grievances by protest was that you were also proving that you could man at least a riotous insurrection, if not an army, if things weren't to go your way. But we have democratized and de-democratized violence. Violence is easy to do. You don't need to train your whole life to do it anymore. You don't need a coterie of men who've just learned how to ride on horseback and shoot arrows their entire life to do it. That requires a lot of energy and social engineering to maintain. Frankly, modern weaponry democratizes that, but then the cost of that modern weaponry and the monopolization of that modern weaponry means that there's a high barrier to entry. So you're not proving you can field an army anymore by protesting. So it's not going to threaten them. You might be proving you can field voters, but it doesn't really necessarily translate to that. We literally have more than a half century of data on this. And then, so what is the thing you can do at these rallies? Well, one, if you do them all the time, you're going to burn people out. They're exciting at first. They get people interested, but over the more and more you do them, the less and less they return. You need to use them to find people who share your values, to invite them in at relatively low stakes and have them participate in skin in the game actions that are not just protesting. Protesting as an action does not do much politically for people outside of the people who agree with the protest. You do need to realize that. If you think it's going to scare your legislatures or whatever, that's only true if you're their constituency. And frankly, most of the time, because of the way we are gerrymandered and federated, that's not the case. So you have to think about more than that. And you should be watching for people trying to use your protest and rallies to siphon off resources into something fruitless. Because I think we did see a lot of that after the Black Lives Matter protests both times. And we've relegated talking about that to the right because we're afraid of ever critiquing anything is capitulating to the right in some way. And then all of a sudden the right's in charge and you look like fucking idiots anyway. So just be honest. That's why I've gone over these historical debates about Dimsent and everything else, is I've wanted people to kind of deduce principles for how to do this. On the left, we have a tendency to bureaucratize. We have a tendency to over rely on already existing institutions that we think we control and we don't. We have a tendency to then to overcompensate and rely on spontaneous action. And we really like bureaucracy and specialization, even though we're supposedly about equality. This in particular is a bad trait. I hope that helps you start to generate some actual principles for actually dealing with how to stop burnout. Because what a lot of people are doing is asking people to sacrifice tons of stuff for organizations that might make a few people in an organization feel like they have power, but don't lead to a lot of results, don't pay back to people individually. You're just demanding self-sacrifice without anything in return. You cannot do that forever. Start thinking about this instead of just throwing the word organizing around over and over again. Start thinking around what systems are you going to use to organize? How are you going to change the way you talk to different people? How do you level this in and out depending on levels of agreement? How do you build programs and virtues and agreement around that? And most importantly, how do you build skin in the game, both socially and not socially? The problem is a lot of people don't want to socialize in the way that they do politics, even though they need to do that to do politics. So you have to have more organic communities develop. If you try to force organic community, well, I hate to tell you, it doesn't usually work. All right, like and subscribe, hit the bell, take care, and I hope this helps you do some things.